"What the hell do you think you're doing?" Charles Walker's voice cut through the nursery like a blade, clipped, cold, furious. Linda jolted awake, disoriented. The baby, Mason, barely stirred, still fast asleep on her chest. Her arms cradled him like instinct, like breathing. "You're the maid," Charles growled, stepping in. Not his mother. Not anything. Linda didn't flinch. She sat up slowly, her hands never leaving the baby's back. "He wouldn't stop crying," she said, steady as stone. No one else came. Charles's jaw tightened. His briefcase hit the floor with a thud. Then he reached down, fast, rough, and ripped Mason from her arms. The baby screamed, instant, gut-wrenching, wild. Tiny fists clawed at the air, legs kicking, his whole body twisting in panic. "Shh, it's all right, buddy," Charles muttered, pacing. But Mason shrieked louder. His cries bounced off the walls like sirens. Linda stood still, watching. A storm was brewing outside the window, but it couldn't touch the one already tearing through that room. "Give him back," she said, voice low. "You're scaring him." Charles turned, fury in his eyes, but he saw it then, the terror in his son's face, the way Mason fought him like a stranger. His grip faltered, and for just a second, he hesitated. Then, slowly, he handed the baby back. The moment Linda touched him, the cries broke, collapsed into soft sobs, then hiccups, then stillness. Mason curled into her chest like nothing else existed, like he'd come home. Charles didn't speak. He couldn't. He stood there, breathing hard, suit soaked from the rain outside, face unreadable. And then he walked out. No apology. No thank you. Just silence. That night, no one spoke of what happened. But the house, that perfect, pristine house, felt different, colder, like something had cracked behind the walls. By morning, Linda moved through the mansion like a shadow, unseen, unacknowledged, but still there, still holding on. And when Mason cried again during nap time, that same piercing wail, the staff panicked, the nanny froze, and someone whispered, "Go get her." But before we begin, click subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from. I hope this story makes you believe kindness comes from the heart. The nursery stayed quiet for the rest of the night, almost too quiet. Outside, rain traced crooked rivers down the windows. Inside, the air hung thick, like something unspoken was still lingering in the corners of the room. Linda didn't sleep. She lay on the floor, Mason resting against her chest, rising and falling with every breath. He hadn't let go of her shirt, and she hadn't tried to move him. Not yet. By morning, the rhythm of the house resumed. Silver trays clinked down on marble countertops. Shoes echoed down the halls. Orders were whispered. Curtains were drawn. But no one said a word about the night before. No one mentioned the crying, the shouting, the stillness that followed. Not the butler, not the nanny, not even Charles Walker. He came down the stairs precisely at 7 a.m., as always, hair combed, tie sharp, jacket flawless. But his eyes looked like they hadn't closed all night. He didn't look at Linda as he passed her in the hallway. Didn't nod, didn't blink, just moved on. Linda didn't care. She wasn't here for his validation. She was here for the baby. She'd been folding laundry in the back corridor when the first wail pierced the air. Mason, shrill, desperate, not hungry, not bored, panicked. The sound of a child who remembered something, or someone, missing. Linda froze. Footsteps scrambled upstairs. The nannies, the housekeepers. Doors opened, closed, opened again. Still the crying didn't stop. Then came the voice, low, grumbling, not hers. "Charles." "Try the bottle," he snapped. No, rock him, Jesus. He was fine earlier." Mason screamed louder. Linda dropped the towel, took a breath, started walking. She didn't ask permission. She didn't knock. She stepped into the nursery like it was second nature, like it was hers. Mason was red-faced, thrashing in the nanny's arms. Charles stood nearby, jaw clenched, sleeves rolled, helpless. Linda held out her arms. No one spoke. The nanny hesitated, but Charles gave the tiniest nod. And the moment Mason landed against Linda's chest, silence. Just like that. His tiny hand gripped her collar, his breathing slowed, and the room exhaled with him. The butler, standing in the doorway, murmured under his breath, "He only sleeps with her now." Charles didn't respond. He just stared, not at the baby, at the woman holding him. That night, Charles stood outside the nursery again. His hand hovered above the doorknob, but he didn't turn it. Inside, Linda was singing. Something soft, familiar, not in words, just sound. Mason had fallen asleep minutes ago, but she kept singing anyway. Maybe for him, maybe for herself. Charles leaned against the doorframe. He didn't understand it, didn't know what to call it, didn't want to admit how much it moved him. Later, Linda walked back to her quarters, Mason's scent still on her shirt. Her steps were quiet, her shoulders straight. She passed Charles in the hallway. He stood at the window, phone in hand, unread messages glowing on the screen. He didn't look up, but as she passed, he said, barely audible, "Thank you." She paused. Just a second. Then kept walking. The next morning, Mason cried again during nap time. The nanny tried. The lullaby app failed. Charles closed his laptop, rubbed his temple. Downstairs, the butler waited in the hall like he already knew what was coming. Charles stood in the doorway, jaw tight, tie loose. Then he muttered it, not an order, not a plea, just a truth he couldn't fight anymore. Bring her. The second time she held him, it was different. No shouting, no storm, no accusations flying through the air, just a hallway full of tension and a man trying to pretend he hadn't spent the last 10 minutes failing to soothe his own child. Mason had cried himself hoarse, red-faced, breath-catching, tiny limbs flailing against the air like it had betrayed him. Charles stood at the window, still in his dress shirt, the cufflinks missing. The nanny hovered near the crib, arms trembling. And Linda. She stepped in like she already knew, didn't speak, didn't wait, just reached. The baby was in her arms before anyone could question it. Within seconds, the screaming faded into soft, shuddering breaths. Charles didn't move. He just watched. Like maybe if he stood still enough, it wouldn't sting so much. The butler broke the silence. "I believe he only sleeps with her now." Charles didn't answer, but the words stayed, long after Linda left the nursery, long after Mason drifted off in her arms, lips parted in peace, long into the night. Later in the kitchen, the staff whispered like guilt was catching. "She must have done this before," one said. "Maybe she's a mother," another offered. "Or maybe," the housekeeper muttered, "the baby just knows softness, knows safety, knows what it feels like to be held like he matters." Charles pretended not to listen, but he stood just outside the archway, fists in his pockets, eyes fixed on the floor. When he went to bed, he left the hallway light on. That night, in case, Linda lay awake, not because she couldn't sleep, but because she didn't want to. She hadn't touched a crib in years, not since her little sister outgrew the one they shared in a 2-bedroom apartment above a liquor store. Back then, Linda had rocked babies while studying for exams, burned formula in the microwave while helping with math homework. She didn't drop out of nursing school. She stopped going. There's a difference. One means you gave up. The other means the world pushed too hard, and no one helped you stand back up. She never told anyone in this house that part. Why would she? They didn't ask. The next morning, Linda took the long route through the garden, just to breathe. The air was crisp. The roses had begun to wilt, but the quiet helped. She passed a fountain near the east wing and caught her reflection in the water. Tired eyes, sleepless face. A woman the world looked straight through, unless she was holding someone else's baby. Inside, the day moved like clockwork. Polished glass, folded sheets, measured steps. Linda cleaned the sitting room without a word, until the housekeeper, Margaret, passed by and whispered, "Word is he stood in the hallway for 30 minutes last night, just listening to you sing." Linda didn't stop wiping the mirror. but her hand paused, only for a second. Upstairs, Charles paced the nursery again. He hovered by the crib, watching Mason sleep. He didn't know the lullaby, didn't know how to hold his son without feeling like he'd break him. Grief had hardened his hands. Guilt had sealed his mouth shut. He sat on the rocking chair, the one Linda had used, and tried humming the tune from memory. It came out flat, broken, off-key. But Mason stirred, then sighed. A soft sound, not a cry. Progress. That evening, Charles stood outside Linda's door. He raised a hand to knock, stopped, lowered it, lifted it again. Still, he couldn't bring himself to do it. Inside, Linda sat on the edge of her bed, folding Mason's blanket tighter than it needed to be. She knew he was out there, could feel it, but she didn't move. Let him be the one to figure it out. The next morning, she found a folded note tucked under a teacup near the nursery. No envelope, no signature, just a single line. "I'm not good at this, but I'm trying." She didn't smile. But something in her chest eased, just a little. And that afternoon, when Mason cried again, loud and urgent, Charles didn't wait. He didn't call the nanny, didn't look for the housekeeper. He found Linda in the linen hallway, didn't say a word, just met her eyes and handed her the baby. The Walker estate was big enough to hold noise, but it didn't. Not real noise, not laughter, not grief. Just the polished silence of too many rooms with no one talking. Charles liked it that way, or at least he told himself he did. After Elise died, he didn't change the nursery, didn't remove her books, didn't repaint the walls she picked. He replaced their presence with employees, nannies, nurses, assistants who didn't ask questions. He moved meetings to the West Wing, avoided the baby monitor, left at sunrise, came home after dark. It was easier to drown in emails than memories. But now a voice hummed through the house each night, not Elise's, not his, hers, Linda. He didn't know when it started, the pull. At first, it was just relief. The baby slept when she was there. Then it was curiosity, how she never flinched when Mason wailed, how her voice stayed soft, even when no one was listening. Then it became something else, a noise in the quiet. That morning, he sat at the breakfast table, coffee growing cold, papers untouched. The staff buzzed around him, setting plates, checking clocks. Linda passed through carrying a folded basket of towels. She didn't look at him, didn't nod, just walked. But he noticed something in the way she moved, like a shadow determined to stay in the light. Later, in the nursery, he tried again. Mason was awake, fussy, not screaming, just unsettled. Charles picked him up awkwardly. Stiff arms, wrong angle. The baby squirmed. He glanced at the rocking chair, sat down, started swaying. "I'm your dad," he muttered, like the words might explain anything. Mason whined, reached toward the door, as if he already knew what was missing. Linda entered a moment later, bottle in hand. She hesitated. He didn't leave, didn't hand the baby off immediately either, just looked at her, then said, flat, honest, "I don't know how to do this." She sat beside him, not close, not far. "He doesn't care about perfect," she said, adjusting Mason's blanket. "He just wants to feel safe." For a moment, neither of them moved. The only sound was Mason's soft breath and the distant ticking of a wall clock. Then Charles said quietly, "I used to think I was strong because I didn't feel anything." Linda looked at him but didn't speak. "I gave a keynote last year about resilience," he said. "How to push through, stay focused." He let out a breath that sounded more like a confession. "I hadn't held my son in 3 days when I said that." Linda didn't blink, just whispered, "Then maybe it's time to redefine strong." Later that night, she found something unexpected in the nursery, a baby book tucked behind the bookshelf. Dusty, worn. Inside the front cover, a note in delicate handwriting. "If I don't make it, tell him I wanted the name Mason. Tell him I dreamed of his smile." Elise Linda traced the words with her fingers. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Some grief, just lives in the skin. She placed the book gently back on the shelf. Charles stood in the doorway. He'd seen her find it. He didn't ask questions, just said, "That was hers." Linda nodded. "I figured." A pause. "I wasn't snooping." "I know." Another pause. "She wrote that the week before." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. They sat on opposite ends of the rug, Mason asleep in the crib between them. A long stretch of silence filled the room, but this time it didn't feel cold, just full. Before she left, Charles looked up. His voice was rough but clear. "Will you stay while I read to him?" Linda blinked, then sat back down beside him. No words, no explanation, just quiet. And maybe that was the first real thing between them. Charles hadn't meant to wait outside her door, but when he got there, he couldn't knock. He stood there, hand hovering, jaw tight, like there was a war happening just beneath his skin. He didn't know how to say it, not the apology, not the truth, not any of it. So instead, he left something. A small folded note, pressed between the doorframe and the wood. Just 4 words, written in black ink. "You were doing more." The next morning, Linda found it. She didn't smile, didn't roll her eyes, just tucked the note into her apron pocket and got back to folding sheets. In the nursery, Mason was already reaching for her before she stepped into the room. Arms stretched, face lit. She scooped him up without thinking. "Good morning, little man," she whispered, resting her cheek on his head. Charles stood near the window watching, not with suspicion, not even with surprise, just watching. "I owe you more than a note," he said finally. Linda turned, not letting go of the baby. "I know." He shifted, rubbing the back of his neck. "I judged you." She didn't interrupt. "I saw you holding him, and all I could think was how wrong it looked. Not because you were wrong, but because I—" He stopped, looked down. "I was scared." Linda let the words settle. She wasn't interested in easy redemption, not after the things he'd said. But this wasn't about ego. It was about Mason. And Mason deserved a father who told the truth, even if it came out late. "You were doing what I couldn't," Charles added, "and I hated that." Linda exhaled slowly. "I wasn't trying to take your place," she said. "I just didn't want him to cry alone." That evening, Charles sat with her in the nursery while she rocked Mason. The silence between them wasn't sharp anymore. It was soft, waiting, becoming something else. "I hired people, so I wouldn't have to feel this," he said. "I signed forms, built walls. I thought keeping busy meant I was coping." Linda nodded, brushing her fingers gently over Mason's hair. "And now?" "I think I've been hiding from my own child," he whispered. Later that night, Linda stood at the sink rinsing baby bottles when Margaret walked in. "He's not himself lately," the housekeeper said, wiping her hands on a towel. Linda kept her eyes on the water. "He's softer." Margaret chuckled softly. That's not a word anyone's ever used for Charles Walker. Linda didn't respond, but in her chest something shifted. Not pity, not hope. Something quieter, recognition. Before bed, she passed the nursery and paused. Charles was inside, alone, holding Mason, humming something off-key, her lullaby but broken. She didn't open the door, just leaned her forehead against the frame, eyes closed, and listened. The next morning, Charles invited her to breakfast. No announcement, no explanation, just a quiet knock at the laundry room door. "There's fresh coffee," he said. Linda hesitated. He waited. She followed. The table was already set. Silver cutlery, pressed napkins, orange juice in crystal glasses. But something was different. His tie was missing. His sleeves were rolled. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his voice was steady. He poured her coffee without asking how she liked it, and somehow got it exactly right. They didn't talk much, just ate, shared space. Let the silence do what it was finally learning to do, hold, not hide. Upstairs, the staff whispered. "Did you see them?" She was at the table. He poured her coffee. Margaret just shook her head and said, "Well, maybe it's about time someone in this house got seen." After breakfast, Charles lingered at the front door as Linda prepared Mason's bottle. He looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her. And for the first time, he didn't look like a CEO or a widower or a man managing loss behind a $10,000 suit. He just looked tired, human. "I keep thinking," he said, "what if it had been me in that room the first time? What if I'd held him instead of shouting?" Linda met his gaze. "Then maybe he'd be reaching for you instead of me." A beat of silence. Then she added, softer, "But maybe it was supposed to happen this way." Charles didn't reply. He didn't need to. His eyes said enough. They always did, once he let them. That night, as she passed the nursery, she didn't stop. She didn't need to listen anymore, because the lullaby was still playing, off-key, broken but real. And for now that was enough. It started with whispers, nothing loud, nothing direct, just half-sentences passed in hallways, pauses when she entered a room, glances held a second too long. Linda had heard it all before. She was used to being underestimated, dismissed, misread. But this time felt different. Because now someone in the house was scared of what she might mean. It was the nanny who said it first, low under her breath, just loud enough for the assistant to hear. "She's getting too comfortable." The assistant didn't reply, just looked up from her tablet with tight lips and a tighter mind. By noon the whole East Wing had heard about the breakfast, not the one with linen napkins and coffee, the one with Charles and her, together. No staff, no baby, no barrier. Margaret caught up with Linda in the laundry room. "They're talking," she said gently, folding pillowcases. "They always do." Linda didn't look up. "But you need to know, it's reaching his office now. His sister called. So did a board member." Linda paused. "Why?" Margaret shrugged. "Because the world gets nervous when a man in power starts looking at someone the world thinks should stay invisible." Upstairs, Mason babbled happily on Linda's hip. His tiny fingers tugged gently at her braid, gurgling every time she kissed his cheek. Charles watched from the doorway. He'd stopped pretending not to watch. Later that evening, the assistant finally said it out loud. "You should be careful," she told Charles, voice clipped, eyes sharp. "You're opening doors that don't close cleanly." He didn't look up from his laptop. "Meaning?" "Meaning she's the help, and people are watching. Investors, partners, your image matters." Charles shut the laptop slowly. "Does my son's peace matter?" The assistant's mouth twitched. "I'm just saying, be smart." The next morning, Linda found her routine broken. Her name was missing from the baby's feeding chart. The nannies had been written in. She said nothing, just walked away. By the third day, Mason had screamed through 3 naps, refused 2 bottles, and thrown the nanny's bracelet across the room. When Linda passed by the nursery, Charles was pacing. "Where is she?" he snapped. "She's off," the nanny replied, flustered. "You said—" "I said nothing." He didn't wait. He found Linda in the garden, near the broken bench no one sat on. She was tying her apron tighter, trying to hold her expression still. "You gave me a day off." "I gave you space." "Well, now you have it." Mason's cry echoed from the nursery window. Linda didn't move. Charles stepped closer. His voice cracked, not with anger, but with something sharper. "He won't stop. Not for them, not for me." Linda looked up, eyes steady, voice calm. "Don't ask me to fix what you're afraid to face." Charles didn't answer, but he didn't walk away either. That night, Linda returned. No one said a word. No one welcomed her back. But Mason reached for her before she crossed the threshold of the nursery. He buried his face into her shoulder, like nothing had changed, like she'd never left. Charles stood in the hallway, watching through the half-open door. She didn't speak to him, didn't need to. The silence between them now had shape, weight, intention. Later, at the edge of the grand staircase, Charles stopped her. "I heard what they've been saying. She didn't blink. "I don't care." "I do," he said, "because you're not what they say you are. I know who I am." He looked away, then back. "I don't want you to leave again." For a second, Linda thought about saying something sharp, something to remind him that she didn't belong to this house, or to him. But the truth was louder. "Then make space for me to stay." 2 days later, Charles called her into the study. It wasn't about Mason. There was a folder on the desk, pages, diagrams, names. He looked up as she stepped in. "I want to start something. A foundation." Linda raised an eyebrow. "For Elise?" "Yes, but not in memory of her. In honor of what she didn't get the chance to do." She opened the folder, and there it was, the Elise Grace Foundation, a non-profit for single mothers, caregivers, women who held things together in silence. Her voice caught before she could answer. Charles stepped closer. "I want you to be part of it." She didn't say yes right away. When Charles asked her to join the foundation, Linda just stood there, one hand still on the folder, the other clenched by her side. He waited. No pressure, no persuasion, just waited. And that, more than anything, made her consider it. Later that night, she sat on the edge of her bed, the documents spread out like blueprints for a life she'd never imagined she'd be invited to build. Single mothers, displaced caregivers, women who raised children that weren't their own, and disappeared quietly into the background when no one needed them anymore. For the first time, someone wanted to give them a name, a platform, a future, and that someone was Charles Walker. She said yes the next morning, not with a handshake, not with a speech, just a quiet nod as she handed him a revised draft of the mission statement. He read it once, then again, and when he looked up, something in his face had softened. "You rewrote this?" "I lived it," she said. The days that followed moved differently. Linda spent less time in the laundry room and more time in the sunlit corner office Charles offered her off the library. It wasn't big, but it had a view of the garden. Her name wasn't on the door. Not yet. But there was a cup with her initials, a desk drawer with a lock, a notebook only she touched, and slowly the staff stopped whispering. Because you don't whisper about someone who's already walking like she belongs. Mason adjusted instantly. He ran to her when she walked through the door, tugged her scarf off, reached for her hair. But one afternoon something changed. She was bending down to tie his shoe when he looked up, wide-eyed, certain, and said it. "Mama." The room went still. Linda froze. Charles, standing near the doorway, didn't move. Not even his breath gave him away. She started, but the word caught. Mason giggled, proud of himself, reached for her again. She didn't correct him, didn't scold, didn't flinch. She just pulled him close and kissed his forehead. That night she stood outside Charles's office, folder in hand, trying to decide whether to knock. Inside she heard voices, low and serious. A reporter, some kind of feature for the launch event, then something that made her still. "She's not the nanny," Charles said. "She's the heart of this home." Silence. Then the sound of a pen clicking, pages flipping. Linda stepped away before he saw her, but her hands trembled for the rest of the night. She didn't speak about the mama moment, neither did Charles, but something shifted, in the space between them, in the way he started asking for her thoughts in meetings, waiting for her nod before finalizing decisions. She wasn't just a helper anymore, she was trusted. And yet, the tension stayed, thick and quiet. It lingered in the hallway after late-night strategy calls, hung in the air when they stood too close in the nursery, grew heavier when their hands almost touched, and didn't. It all came to a point on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Charles was leaning over her desk, reviewing grant proposals. Mason was asleep on a mat beside her chair, one small hand wrapped around the hem of her skirt. They were close, too close. His shoulder brushed hers as he reached for a pen. She didn't move. He didn't either. The air between them held its breath. Then the front door rang. The housekeeper's voice echoed faintly through the hall. "Mr. Walker, you have visitors." He straightened. Too fast. Linda stood up, too slowly. Minutes later, Linda opened the front door and froze. An elegant woman stood on the marble steps, pearls at her throat, a leather clutch folded tight in one hand. Behind her, a man, tall, grey-haired and disapproving, looked past Linda like she was a fingerprint on a glass wall. "We'd like to see our grandson," the woman said. Linda stepped aside, but didn't bow her head. "He's resting," she said plainly. "And who are you?" "Linda Patterson." The woman's mouth pinched. "The maid." Linda's gaze didn't falter. "The one who stayed." The last time someone looked at her like that, Linda was 16, standing outside a grocery store, holding her baby brother's hand, explaining why she couldn't pay for formula. That same look, not anger, not even disgust, just dismissal. Like she was a problem, a mistake, a line that didn't belong on the page. Mrs. Hawthorne, Elise's mother, didn't step inside right away. She hovered just past the threshold like she expected the house to apologize. Her husband, lean and silent, glanced at the portraits on the wall and made a noise under his breath. "It still smells like her," he said. Charles appeared behind Linda, his voice quiet but firm. "It's Mason's home now." They were led to the sitting room. Linda stayed back. She didn't belong in that kind of room, not in most houses. But Charles glanced over his shoulder and held the door. She followed. Mrs. Hawthorne sat straight-backed on the edge of the sofa, coat still on, as if to say she wouldn't be staying long. Her eyes scanned the room like it wasn't clean enough, warm enough, worthy enough. Then Mason toddled in, still in his footy pajamas, hair wild with sleep. He saw Linda first, ran straight to her. Mrs. Hawthorne's expression cracked. Just for a second, just long enough for something bitter to slip through. "He doesn't remember us," she whispered. Her husband shifted. "He's young. That's expected." But Mason didn't even glance at them. He buried his face into Linda's neck, sighing like he'd been away too long. Mrs. Hawthorne stood. "May I hold him?" Linda looked to Charles. He gave a small nod. She passed the boy over, gently, slowly. But the moment he left her arms, the moment her warmth disappeared, Mason's face twisted, and then the crying began. Not a tantrum, not a protest, a panic. He writhed in his grandmother's arms, sobbing, reaching back toward Linda, tiny fists clenching, voice shaking the walls. Charles stepped in, trying to calm him. It didn't work. Mrs. Hawthorne tried to shush him, sway him, whisper his name. He only screamed louder. Then Linda opened her arms again. No fanfare, no question. Just offered herself. Mason threw himself into her chest like a drowning boy to shore, and the silence that followed was devastating. Mrs. Hawthorne sat back down, trembling now, quiet in a way that didn't feel proud anymore. "I thought we were doing the right thing," she said, "giving Charles space, letting the staff handle everything." Linda didn't speak, didn't need to. The baby curled into her lap was louder than any explanation. Later, when the visitors left, their voices softer, their pride dented, Linda found Charles standing alone in the garden doorway. The sky was low, pale, the kind of grey that made the roses look tired. She hated conflict, he said, watching the clouds. Elise. She hated confrontation. But she would have fought for him, for his calm. I know she would have. Linda stepped beside him. Mason slept on her shoulder, still clinging to her braid like a thread he refused to let go. "You think she would have liked me?" Linda asked quietly. Charles didn't answer right away. He didn't speak in flattery or empty comfort. Only truth. "I think she would have seen you the way he sees you." Linda nodded once. That was enough. That night, Charles came to the nursery after the house had gone still. He stood in the doorway. Linda was rocking Mason gently, a soft hum filling the room. When she saw him, she didn't stop. She just kept singing. He didn't ask to take over, didn't say a word, just sat on the rug beside her, his back against the wall, head tipped toward the ceiling. Minutes passed. The hum softened. The silence returned. "I never thought grief would make me cruel," he said. Linda blinked. but didn't interrupt. "I didn't see you. Not at first. I just saw someone crossing a line. One I drew to protect myself." He looked at her, eyes red, not from tears, from holding them back too long. "You didn't cross a line," he whispered. "You stood in the space I was too scared to enter." Linda didn't answer. She reached down, her fingers brushing his, and for the first time he didn't pull away. "Stay," he said, voice low. Not a demand, not a request, just a man asking someone not to leave. She looked at him, then at the sleeping boy between them and said, "I already have." The first time she saw her name on a door, Linda didn't know what to say. It wasn't handwritten. It wasn't taped on. It was engraved. Linda Patterson, Director of Community Outreach. She ran her fingers over the letters, slow, careful, like touching something sacred, like proof. Charles stood behind her, silent, hands in his pockets. She turned. "Why me?" His answer came easy. "Because you show up, every time, for people no one else sees." The launch was 2 weeks away. The Elise Grace Foundation, his late wife's name, but Linda's spirit. They'd worked side by side for hours each day, building something real, something bigger than grief. And somewhere in the middle of all that planning, he stopped calling her the help. The staff stopped calling her the maid, and Mason started calling her home. The night before the gala, Linda couldn't sleep. She stood by the window, barefoot, watching the wind move through the trees. The dress hanging on the closet door wasn't hers, not really. Too soft, too beautiful, too chosen. But Mason's laugh echoed down the hallway, and Charles's voice, low, steady, hummed from the next room. And she thought, maybe belonging isn't something you're given. Maybe it's something you stay long enough to earn. The gala was held in a ballroom that glittered with people who never asked how the table got set. Linda held Mason in one arm, her other hand gently resting against her side, trying to steady her breath. Charles walked beside her, no distance, no denial. They looked like something that had been through a storm and still chose to stand close. The cameras found them. Of course they did. One reporter leaned in too far. Mike pointed like a blade. "Are you the nanny?" Mason turned in Linda's arms, and before she could speak, he answered. He reached for her face, touched her cheek. "Mama." The room stilled. The reporter blinked, and someone's flash went off just as Mason laid his head on her shoulder. Charles didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look on his face was the answer. The next morning, the headline hit every platform. "She's not the help, she's the healing." Linda sat at the kitchen table, the article open on her phone. Margaret poured her coffee without asking. "You all right?" she asked. Linda exhaled. "I didn't come here to be seen." Margaret smiled gently. "But it's about time someone did." Later that night, after the gala and the headlines and the questions, Linda tucked Mason into bed and found Charles standing in the hallway. He looked tired, not from the event, from pretending it didn't matter. "She called," he said. Linda knew who, his sister, or maybe the board, someone with power and no proximity to the truth. "They're worried about optics, about headlines, about—" He trailed off. Linda crossed her arms. "I'm not ashamed of the life I've lived, Charles." "I know. They're not worried about Mason, they're worried about mirrors." He nodded once, silent, then stepped closer. "You said something once," he murmured, "about not falling, about being pushed." She nodded. "I remember." He reached for her hand, held it without hesitation this time. "Then let me stand with you now." She didn't answer right away, but she didn't pull away either. Later that evening, they stood in the garden, Linda in a soft cotton dress. Charles, barefoot in the grass, suit jacket nowhere in sight. Mason toddled between them, chasing a butterfly that refused to be caught. "I never imagined love would look like this," Charles said. Linda looked down, smiling. "Me neither." He took a breath, then said, like it was both question and truth, "But maybe this is the only kind that lasts." They didn't kiss right away. They didn't need to. Not yet. Instead, he brushed a piece of hair from her face, and she leaned into the quiet. A quiet that didn't hurt, a quiet that felt full. Spring arrived slowly that year, not in the way that screamed change, but in the way that whispered it. Mason no longer cried when the wind changed. Charles started showing up to breakfast before the coffee went cold, and Linda? She started walking through the house like it was hers, because somewhere along the way, it became just that. The Elise Grace Foundation launched on a warm April morning. The city skyline glittered behind the stage. Dozens of women filled the seats, some with children, some with scars, all with stories. Linda stood behind the podium, no script, just a room full of people who understood the weight of invisibility. "I'm not here because of a resume," she said. "I'm here because someone gave me a chance, not to work harder, but to be seen." She looked down at the front row. Charles stood there, Mason on his hip. The little boy clapped, out of rhythm but with full heart. The audience followed. It wasn't applause for a speech. It was for a truth they recognized. Afterward, reporters swarmed Charles. Questions about legacy, love, leadership. He answered only one clearly. "She's not my employee," he said, looking at Linda. "She's my partner, in mission and in life." That night, the house was quiet again. Not the kind of silence that came from grief, the kind that comes from peace. Linda stood in the nursery, reading softly from a worn book. Mason lay in her lap, his eyes fluttering closed. Charles leaned against the doorway, a mug of tea in his hand. The book had a note inside, Elise's handwriting. Linda read it once a week, not out of mourning, but to remember where this story began. When she closed the cover, Mason stirred. She tucked the blanket tighter, kissed his forehead. "Good night, baby," she whispered, then looked over her shoulder. Charles was still there, still watching, still learning how to stay. He stepped into the room, pulled up the second rocking chair, the one that used to sit empty. They sat in silence, Mason between them, the past behind them, and something unspoken growing in the space they hadn't yet named. "You changed this house," Charles said softly. Linda looked at him. "No," she whispered. "He did. He just needed someone to see him first." Charles reached for her hand. No ceremony, no hesitation. She laced her fingers through his, and the room held it all, the weight, the release, the truth. Outside, the garden had started blooming again, not in perfect rose, not in perfect color, but in life. The kind that grows after long winters, the kind that doesn't ask permission. Mason shifted in his sleep, his small hand brushing against Linda's chest. She held it, looked down, then up. Charles was watching her with the kind of eyes that had stopped needing walls. "You were the miracle we never saw coming," he said. Linda didn't blink, didn't smile, just nodded once, slow and sure, then said, "You didn't need to see me." She looked down at the baby curled against her heart. He did, and that was enough. If this story stirred something in you, a memory, a feeling, or even just a moment of stillness, don't leave quietly. At Elevated Heart Stories, we share more than fiction. We share real moments, the kind that move hearts, open eyes, and remind us what it means to be seen. So if this story found you at the right time, take a second to subscribe, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from, because your voice might be the light someone else is waiting for. Until next time, stay kind, stay human, and keep your heart elevated.